Greetings. Welcome to a Clear Mountain Wednesday live stream. Today we're blessed to be joined by Professor Salomon, who is I have a brief introduction, just William P. and Ruth Gerd Berdering University Professor Emeritus of Sanskrit, and was one of the foremost researchers into the ancient Gandhari scrolls at University of Washington, and is continuing his studies currently as well. I'm sure I butchered much of that, Richard, but I was hoping that you would be able to introduce yourself to some extent as well. But let me first just welcome you and thank you for joining us.
Okay, glad to be here.
So, Professor Salomon, would you mind telling us your course of studies, what you've worked with during your career, and how that's related to the Buddhist teachings, and what you're working on currently?
My career has had a kind of twists and turns, as I think most successful academic careers do. I first became aware of Buddhism when I was an undergraduate in the 1960s in a sort of hippie-ish context. So that was the way it was then. And so I started to study formally while I was still in college in the 60s, and I started studying Sanskrit. And so that Sanskrit has been sort of my baseline throughout, but I've played different tunes on that line. I went to graduate school. I began in 1970 in Pennsylvania, and I went as a primarily Sanskrit student. So at that point, I actually wasn't doing much in Buddhist studies. I was doing more of the Hindu, Brahmanical, Vedic world of study. Then I came to the University of Washington in around 1980, after I finished my PhD and kicked around for a few years. So I was hired as professor of Sanskrit, but the University of Washington has always had a strong tradition of Buddhist studies. It's always been one of the leading Buddhist studies programs in the United States or in North America. So mainly because I was sort of fitting myself into a Buddhist studies oriented program, I sort of turned back more towards Buddhist literature and gradually spent more time on Buddhist literature and less on the Hindu Brahmanical side. And then in around 1996, let me back up a bit. I was also interested in Indian inscriptions, particularly Buddhist inscriptions. And that's actually how I got involved in the Gandhara manuscripts, because I had worked on inscriptions, Buddhist inscriptions in Gandhari language for some years. So that prepared me, although I certainly didn't expect it, it prepared me for the study of the Gandhari manuscripts, which came to light in 1995. And then that, not immediately, but very quickly became my main focus. And it's been what I've been working on mostly for most of the past 30 years, and no end in sight. And did you ask me about my current project? Are we going to talk about that now or later?
Yes, although perhaps you could touch on that, but I think we'll backtrack in just a second to the Gandhari manuscripts.
Yeah. So I'll let's go back to the manuscript, and then I'll get to
that sounds good chronologically. So first, people can type questions into the chat that they would like to ask at a later point. So would you tell us about the Gandhari manuscripts? Why did they catch your attention, and what insights have come out of them? What's your research into them been about, and what has it revealed?
Read my book. So my simple answer, now it's already 5 years ago, I published a book which tried to summarize for a sort of Buddhist-oriented but non-specialist audience, summarizing what had been learned and until then. Um, I'm sorry, what was the question?
Well, first, what's the name of your book so that we can reference it?
Yeah, I didn't mean to turn this into a sales.
No, this is a useful resource, and we can.
It's called this Buddhist Literature of Ancient Gandhara.
Oh, great, and we'll link to that in the notes. So, if you basically, I think most people don't know what the Gandhara manuscripts are, or what sort of key insights came out of the study of them. Why were they worth studying? What do they reveal about the Buddha's teaching or Buddhism's development? If you had to give us kind of a Spark Notes version.
Okay, kind of the thesis of my book, the big answer is that there's a lot more to Buddhism than we knew about. Or let me rephrase, there's a lot more to the history of Buddhism than we knew about or guessed before. And one of the people who commented on very helpfully on our work, very constructively, a Buddhist scholar from Thailand named Peter Skilling, he used the phrase many Buddhisms, so Buddhism in the plural. Of course, everybody knows there are different kinds or manifestations of Buddhism, but the point of Peter's remarks and the point of my work is that there were many more Buddhisms than we knew about before. And I'm talking mostly about in India. Everybody knows Buddhism died out in India. I know that's not literally true, but effectively or practically or mostly died out in India almost 1,000 years ago. Why that happened, that's another whole lecture. But it happened, unfortunately. So as far as the literature, the text, the scriptures of the Pali tradition have survived because that's a living tradition, and Buddhism survives in different forms in East Asia and China and Japan and so forth. But I'm talking really about Indian Buddhism. And what the Gandharan manuscripts show, which in retrospect is not surprising, but it was very exciting at the time, that here was a whole Buddhist world. And we sort of knew that Gandhara was a Buddhist world from the inscriptions that I was talking about. I'm talking about the early AD period. We knew there was a Buddhist world there, but we didn't know what their literature was. Well, now we do. Now we know quite a lot about it. Why? Mainly because, well, this is my theory, manuscripts survived there for two reasons. For cultural reasons, which is that they had a habit, the Gandharan Buddhists. Maybe I should say where Gandhara is.
Yes, yeah, please.
Sorry, it's hard for me to,
No, there's much context to give, absolutely.
So, footnote. Sorry, can't help it, I'm a professor. Footnote, Gandhara is, in modern geographical terms, approximately northern Pakistan, eastern Afghanistan, and adjoining regions of India and Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. So this was the northwestern corner of the Indian Buddhist world. And we knew that it was an important Buddhist area from the inscriptions that I mentioned and from the famous Gandharan school of sculpture that you can go to Seattle Art Museum and see some excellent examples of that. But what's exciting and new is that we have not only their art and their inscriptional records and their architectural remains, which are, by the way, all over that part of the world. If you ever happen to get to Pakistan and you go up to the north, and you can see incredible remains of Buddhist institutions. So why did the literature survive there and not in the rest of India? I mean, we never find ancient Buddhist manuscripts in the rest of India. We get in Nepal, there are manuscripts, I think, up to about 1,000 years old. But in Gandhara, we have manuscripts that are 2,000 years old, and possibly even more than that. Why? Point A, the climate is different there, and you don't have this extreme steamy uh, monsoon climate that you have in most of India, which causes organic matter to decay very quickly. So the manuscripts, which were written in palm leaf and birch bark, didn't last in Peninsula India. And then there was another lucky piece, which is that the Gandharan Buddhists had a custom of burying manuscripts. And why they did that is a little bit controversial, but presumably, or one theory is that I have referred to the term, I made this up, Dharma insurance, because as you know, there's I think all over Buddhist tradition, there is the idea, the tradition, that the Buddha himself predicted the decline of the Dharma. And in different texts, usually either says either 500 years or 1,000 years, the Dharma will disappear. Well, fortunately, that didn't happen. But my sense, my guess, my theory is that the Buddhists in Gandhara, with that in mind, buried these manuscripts, and they're typically found in big clay pots with a cover that's sealed with wax. And they buried them in or near their monastery in order to preserve the Dharma. So if that's what they really had in mind, it worked. But anyway, that's just my theory. So these were first discovered in around the middle of 1990s, and a group of these manuscripts was donated to the British Library in London. And at that point, I was asked to come and have a look because I'd worked in related materials. When I say related materials, I mean basically materials in the Gandhari language. Okay, I have to give a little sidebar on that. Is that okay?
Please,
I'm rattling on.
No, that's good.
So we're talking about inscriptions, first inscriptions, and then about manuscripts in the Gandhari language. What is Gandhari language? Well, it's related to Sanskrit and Pali. And you can make a sort of a triangle. And Sanskrit's at the top, and Pali is here, and Gandhari is here. So Sanskrit is linguistically the mother, not culturally necessarily in the Buddhist context, but linguistically it's the parent, it's the mom. Pali and Gandhari are languages derived from it. So Gandhari and Pali are sisters. Our knowledge of the Gandhari language is not like that of Pali. Pali is known, it's a living tradition. It's like Latin or Greek or Hebrew. It never died, so we never lost it. Gandhari disappeared for almost 2,000 years. So I and my colleagues and students and collaborators have been working for the last 30 years on reconstructing or constructing a full knowledge of the Gandhari language. And we have lots of clues because triangulating from Sanskrit and Pali, but there are a lot of curveballs in this, and without going into the linguistic details, the language relationships are supposed to be systemic, follow patterns and rules, they're not random, but there's also a lot of loose ends. So we still struggle sometimes to understand the Gandhari words in the Gandhari. But comes to the main point, our knowledge, our level of understanding the language is like 80 or 90%.
Please.
Because of factors I mentioned, these manuscripts were discovered, and now more discoveries were made, and there are now literally hundreds of these manuscripts. or even thousands, but don't take my word for it. It depends how you count them. If you count like every little bit as a separate manuscript, then you have thousands, but most of those little bits fit it. So we have maybe 250 distinct texts.
Have you read them all, Professor Solomon?
Yeah, yes and no. I've read to some extent all the ones that are currently available.
Mm-hmm.
I say that because it's a little premature, but if things go right, there's a large new collection of these manuscripts which will become available. There's something going on now in Pakistan. There's a program to retrieve these manuscripts, and in fact, I've seen them, but they're rolled up. I should have to explain these manuscripts. Okay, the Gandharans wrote these manuscripts on birch bark. So they would cut strips out of a birch tree, and everybody knows, especially you live around here, you know what birch bark looks like. When young birch bark, it's a beautiful, perfect, clear, bright white surface, great for writing. And many cultures around the world have used birch bark for writing, including Native American cultures in Canada. So they would write their texts on scrolls shaped like that, sort of long, tall and thin, and then they would roll them up and presumably put them in their pocket or put them in cubby holes in their ancient monasteries. I don't know, but also, and typically we think when they were starting to be worn out, they would discard them. And I like to think, I can't prove it, that they would, if a manuscript was worn out, they'd copy it onto another new one and take the old one, put it in a clay pot and bury it for ceremonial reasons or for dharma insurance, they call it, or whatever. We don't know exactly why, but we're very glad they did. So I'm going to the point. When we find them, they're rolled up. And the problem is birch bark, when new, and the reason they used it is extremely supple. You can bend it, you can turn, you can roll it, you can twist it, nothing happened. When it's 2,000 years old, it's extremely fragile. So when we find these things, if we're lucky, we get a whole roll, a whole manuscript or a large part of the manuscript that's rolled up. Unrolling it is a huge problem, and mistakes have been made. I won't name any names. People who shouldn't have unrolled them got involved and caused a lot of mess. I mean, these things, if you touch it too hard, it'll crumble into pieces. Anyway, there is a large group of manuscripts that have not yet been unrolled, and I'm hoping that will be done soon, and I'm very excited to find out what's in there. So your question, I do remember your question, have I seen them all? I've seen all the ones that have been unrolled and are visible.
And so if this project of Dharma insurance worked, which it seems to have to some extent, and these scrolls were preserved, was there something in that Dharma insurance which we would not have access to otherwise, viewpoints or perspectives or insights from the Buddhist teaching or the time that are novel to these scrolls or that came from them specifically?
I think someone asked somewhere, this phrase came up, did you find a fifth noble truth? I think somebody asked me that at a presentation I gave in London.
If you did, let us know. Yes.
Well, don't worry. It's not quite a simple yes or no answer, but don't worry. Generally, the concepts, the beliefs, the literature are not way out there. No, there's nothing disturbing. I would say nothing just that would be disturbing to a practicing Buddhist in Sri Lanka, for example, or Thailand. Um, the what we tend to see, well, put it this way: the manuscripts, the documents, the texts that have been discovered and identified, and that would be, I don't know, 100 or more. About half of them, maybe more than half of them, are Gandhari versions of texts that were which exist in Pali, in Sanskrit, in Tibetan, in Chinese, or any combination of the above. They're familiar, you could call them translations of known texts. The other half, more or less, are maybe 40%, are texts that we've never seen before. But there's no fifth noble truth. Actually, there was a funny thing happened in one of these manuscripts of a previously unknown text, a kind of Abhidharma treatise or argument, debate. There actually is a reference to a fifth noble truth, but it's a straw man argument. It's an argument debate between the, I don't know if people are familiar with the Sarvastivadins versus the other school, and the Sarvastivadins say that everything exists in past, present, and future. Someone asks them, well, does it fifth noble truth? So it actually refers to fifth noble truth in one of these manuscripts, and so, my eyes bug out, and then we see the context, and it's just a straw man rhetorical. It's a rhetorical argument. So no fifth noble truth, no radically unusual doctrinal content.
And are any of the, it sounds like some of the novel texts are Abhidhamma or later. Are there any ones that have a decent ring of being the Buddha's own words or original suttas that were lost in the other traditions?
Who am I to judge? I don't think so. I don't see any reason to. We get, Buddhist suttas, especially when you look at the Pali Canon, which I'm sure you're familiar with, there's a lot of cutting and pasting. If you look at like the Anguttara Nikaya, there are, depending on how you cut it, what I think 3,000 or 4,000 sutras, but it's been pointed out, Bhikkhu Bodhi discussed this, that there's a kind of multiplication factor that you can theoretically multiply these and come up with, like, I don't remember, 15,000 suttas or something like that, was number mentioned by somebody. So we do find suttas that were not known to us in the Pali, in the Central Asian Sanskrit, and Chinese translations, but they're not usually radically new. They're different kinds of cuttings and pastings. What we find, well, what to me is interesting and new is what I call local lore, which is stories. These are avadanas. Well, they're labeled as avadanas, but they're not probably like the avadanas you might be familiar with. And they actually present something of the historical circumstances of Buddhism in, let's say, 1st century Gandhara. And actually, there are fragments, unfortunately, there's fragments of discussions between, say, a monk and a king. And these kings are actually living, they're not the kings that are mentioned in ancient texts in the time of the Buddha, but kings at the time these manuscripts were written, 1st and 2nd century. So you're seeing something of the historical processes of the interaction of the secular and religious worlds at that time.
Can you describe that world for us? What was Gandhara in the 1st century like? Were the Alexandrian colonies involved at all? Was there a Greek influence? Were Like, what would it have been like what was Buddhism's world like at that time in that place?
Okay, history of Gandhara lecture. I've done
Or maybe
this
a snapshot. Maybe a snapshot.
snapshot better than lecture. Um, this was, I have a student, a guy called Mike Skinner, who's now did a PhD here now at the University of Hawaii. And he did his dissertation mostly about the Kushana Empire. And the Kushana Empire was the dominant power in Gandhara in the late 1st, 2nd, and early 3rd centuries AD, exactly the time that we're talking about. And Mike argued that the 1st and 2nd century were a very special period in world history. And if you read a world history book, you'll see that there were 3 great empires, the Roman, the Han in China, and the Parthian Empire in Iran. I might point out there was a 4th great empire, which was the Kushan Empire in India, which gets short treatment for certain reasons in conventional history. So, but I totally agree with Mike that it's the problem is that we have less information about it, and that's why it's sort of ignored. Historiographically, it's a difficult period. I won't go into the reasons. The Kushans were originally nomadic herders from Central Asia, and world history in that period is very much governed by the movements of those nomadic tribes, people like the Huns and so forth. And, the Kushans drifted into, they originated somewhere in Central Asia. By Central Asia, I mean Xinjiang or the Tarim Basin, what's now the western edge of China. They drifted down south into the Stans, Uzbekistan, and then into Afghanistan, and then west into India. And to make a long story short, they established this great world-class empire, 1st to 3rd century. And they liked Buddhism. Coming to the point, okay, thanks for your patience. They adopted Buddhism enthusiastically and became great patrons of Buddhism. So that's the cultural context. And this is very important for the history of Buddhism because that opened up a channel for Buddhism, which was very strong in the Northwest, in Gandhara. It was not, if you look at the map, it might look like an outpost from the Indian point of view. It was actually a very central part of that world, largely because the Kushans had this vast empire settled there. And that connection between India and into Central Asia promoted, or at least made possible, the spread of Buddhism from India into Central Asia, into Western China, and eventually all across East Asia. So I've used the term, or someone uses the term, springboard. Gandhara was the springboard of Buddhism's transmission into the rest of North and Central Asia.
Thank you, and I do want to get to some of the chat questions, but I'm very curious, coming from that springboard, we know where those teachings landed in China. I've been interested and spoken with Ajahn Sona a good deal about what may have been a significant influence Buddhism could have had along that Silk Road in Greek and on Western thought, even in an unseen capacity. How much communication do you think there was between those worlds? Do you believe Buddhist texts were written down in the Library of Alexandria? Certainly the original Gandharan sculpture of the Buddha, those were heavily influenced by the Greek outposts. So what about that current that moved westward? What are your feelings about its effects?
Okay, I'll try to give you a short answer, short and straight answer. Um, I doubt very much that there were Buddhist manuscripts in the Library of Alexandria. We'll never know. Burned it down, but I wouldn't expect it. Um, there are 2 points of connection that I'll mention, one of which you might not know about. It might be an interesting surprise for you. One of which you maybe do know about, which is the Questions of King Milinda, which is a Pali text dialogue between the Greek king Milinda, or Menander is his Greek name, and this monk Nagasena. This is the period of the history of Northwest before the Kushan period that I was talking about before. King Menander ruled in that area, in the Northwest, central in Gandhara, around the middle of the 2nd century BC, earlier period. And we know about him. We have, besides the text, we have a couple of inscriptions referring to him. We have very abundant coinage from King Menander. I actually have one coin of Menander in my proud possession. And he, according to that text, the Pali text, he was converted. In fact, was converted to Buddhism by monk Bhikkhu Nagasena. So that's one thing we know for sure. From my point of view, which is that of a hard-headed academic, evidence for connections with Greece. There are parallels in certain philosophical concepts. I frankly don't feel very well qualified to talk about that in detail, but there are common ideas. But academic rules is common ideas don't prove anything, because people have the same ideas. Someone thinks of it, you can be sure that someone else has thought of it. So we only believe it when we can see historical connections. One thing that's happened recently, like within the last year, and actually hasn't been published yet, so I don't expect you to know of, but there's a place called Berenike, which is a Greek city in Egypt. It's right on the coast of Egypt. And it was a major port in ancient times, and approximately the historical period we're talking about. And a lot of, not a lot, but some remains of what are clear Indian remains have been found there. And just recently, this archaeological team headed by an American guy, discovered an inscription, a Buddhist inscription dated to the 3rd century AD. So we're talking about a later period, not a period of classical Greek philosophy, and also some Buddhist statues and also some Hindu statues. So this establishes, not surprisingly, but beautifully, establishes that there was a Indian colony, if you will, trading colony in Egypt in the 3rd century. It's very interesting. It's dated in the year of the Roman king, but it's a Sanskrit inscription dated in the year of the Roman king. We never saw that before. And it's recording a pratima, an image. Unfortunately, we don't know what the image looks like. That's lost. So obviously there were contacts and pretty extensive contacts between the Greek world, or let's say the Hellenistic world, and the Indian world, beginning in the 3rd century BC. But this object I'm talking about now is much later. It's 3rd century AD. But still, it's a huge discovery in terms of the connections.
I'm aware of that. That sort of evidence is rare and
Yeah.
quite amazing, actually. Professor Solomon, I so appreciate you fielding these questions and giving us this wide context. I wanted to give those in the chat a chance to
Oh yeah.
ask you questions, so I'm going to give you some rapid fire ones, if
Okay.
that's okay.
Okay. Hit me.
All right. Charles, I've been told that the Buddha spoke Magadhi. What is the relationship to Sanskrit and Pali and to Gandhari?
Okay. I'll say two things about this question. It's a good question. It's the dreaded question, because the relationship between Pali and Magadhi is very controversial, because on the Theravadan side, or in the Theravada world, in the Pali world, it is believed, assumed, maintained that Pali and Magadhi are the same language. In the academic world, among historical linguists, most say that Magadhi and Pali are not the same. I think of the name that first comes to mind is K.R. Norman, if anybody, he's a major authority, but many people have written about this. And the reason is the linguistic features that we know from other documentation or other evidence, that the linguistic features of the area of northeastern India where Buddhism was born don't agree well with the linguistic features of Pali. What we're talking about, I'll just tell you very briefly without getting technical, it's about R and L. So in these Indian languages, Pali and related languages, there's alternation of R and L, as in many languages, including, in Spanish, for example, and also in English, but it's not so obvious in English. So K.R. Norman and his school will say they can't be the same because they don't work dialectally. This argument has come up recently, and there was an interchange of several articles in academic journals. I'm not remembering the names of the people, but this is a new generation of academics who are rethinking this issue. And I am rethinking it because of this new material. So I don't know, I don't have an answer better than saying it is controversial and remains controversial.
It's a good answer. Do we know anything about the names and the lives of the people who wrote or hid these texts?
Much too little about them. There are no scribal signatures, or very few. So we don't. I think there are two examples that I can think of where it says on the top of or bottom of a manuscript, this manuscript belongs to so and so. Name of a monk. I don't remember the names right offhand. So what we know is only what we can sort of dig up and reconstruct archaeologically. I often wish I could meet one of these guys and ask, what is this word here? But we can find out also, from the inscriptions, we find a lot about their beliefs and practices, because we get these dedicatory inscriptions, sometimes associated with the manuscripts, but in any case representing the same culture and belief system and population. And so we get to see something of their belief systems. For instance, there's a lot of what's academics called transfer of merit. It's karma parinamana, moving that. So when they dedicate a relic, and that's what so much of this stuff is about, the relic cult, I should mention, is very central and important in that area of Buddhism. So we get these inscriptions, many of them accompanying relics or relic donations, and they typically have dedications. They say, I share the merit, or I give the biggest part of the merit to sometimes to the king, sometimes to my father. I want to mention one thing. I know you didn't ask, but it always comes up and it's important. I mentioned it before. What about Mahayana? That's, I anticipate the question.
That was actually one of the next questions.
Okay, then
What insights, if any, do the Gandhara manuscripts provide into
there
the
you
world of
go.
Mahayana? Yes, please.
Perfect setup. Um, the when I published my first book on this material in 1999 on the basis of the early discovery of these kind of manuscripts, and I said no trace of Mahayana in any of this material. Wrong. Subsequent discoveries. First, we found one or two fragments of Mahayana, clearly Mahayana text. Then we found a few more. I think now the count is at 12. There are recognizable fragmentary remains of, um, unquestionably Mahayana texts like Prajnaparamita, and things that there are about 12. What's interesting, a lot is interesting, but what's particularly comes out is that, I mean, you have a pot full of manuscripts, and most of them are, I use the term mainstream. Academics like to use that because what else do you call it? What that which is not Mahayana. And Theravada is not an accurate term technically because Theravada is only part of mainstream Buddhism. So in Gandhara, you have mainstream Buddhism, and we know many of the Nikayas. These are Nikayas, most of which are dead in modern Buddhism, but particularly Dharmaguptakas, Mahishāsakas, Mahasangikas, Sarvastivadins, and a few others that I'm not remembering.
And just to clarify, the Nikayas are the schools of Buddhism or the sects.
Yeah. So traditionally, there were said to be 18 Nikayas, schools, sects, whatever. Of them, really, Theravada was only one of the 18, but it's the one that survived. The others essentially died out or turned into something else. So in these groups of manuscripts, in part, we find occasionally we find the Mahayana texts are not in any way separate. They're found together with these mainstream Dharmaguptaka or whatever texts. And I think all of the examples of Mahayana texts, or the 12 or so, were found together with, just jumbled together in the same box. So we definitely get the feeling that, well, I think most people, I mean, at least academic historians, all agree that Mahayana originated, or some could say first became visible in 1st century AD. That sounds about right. And we're dealing with material from about that period. So what we see is that Mahayana and non-Mahayana material were apparently living together and getting along well. There was no sense of separation. And how to explain that, I don't know. I'm not really the expert. I think of one of my collaborators. You might know Paul Harrison at Stanford. Is a main authority on this early history of early Mahayana. Excuse me. But you definitely get the impression that there was not a separation. And the Mahayana seemed to be, I don't mean to be irreverent, but kind of an optional course, or an optional way that some monks followed and some, maybe the others didn't, but living together in the same monastery. But the main thing is that this shows that early Mahayana Buddhism, Buddhist literature, was in Gandhara. I'm not saying it was only in Gandhara, but it's clear that early Mahayana Buddhist literature was not composed in Sanskrit, even though until now, we found it mostly in Sanskrit or in Chinese. And so,
Thank you, Professor Solomon. And I have heard that the Mahayana and the Theravada were initially really both streams that flowed to the same monasteries and communities until later.
yeah.
We do have to wrap things up, but one final question. If you could travel back in time and ask one question of one of these scribes, what would it be? Just to put you on the spot and see what happens.
It would be, what's this word?
What's this
On
word?
any given day, there's a word that I am scratching my head over. But I mean, that would be the first question, but there would be many more.
Great.
My other question would be, why did you bury that stuff? Was that for us?
I like it. Thank you. Well, I'm going to post the link to the Zoom for those who join us regularly. As you know, we have a Zoom discussion from 6:45 to 7:30. Professor Solomon has to pack for a trip, so won't be joining us. But Professor Solomon, we're so grateful for the work you've done and are doing, bringing to light these scriptures, and also just for taking the time to join us. It's great to know you're in Seattle nearby, and I hope we get to speak with you again.
Okay, please stay in touch. Glad to meet everybody. Okay, dinner time for me. Okay, goodbye.